Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of, well, absolute precision. It's almost like engineering.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, like you break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the film, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is. That's the problem.
Right. It's completely binary. You look at the image, and the bone is either broken or not broken. The data is clean.
It's clean, and honestly, it's comforting. I mean, we like things to be visible. We like them to be categorized neatly. But then you step into the world of textual criticism and ancient manuscripts, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just broken.
Yeah, it really is.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, well, it's murky. You're looking at shadows and blurs and trying to determine what the original bone even looked like before the fracture.
It's the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, you are dealing with copies of copies of copies, separated by centuries, continents, and entirely different languages.
Well, welcome to Reformed Thinking and to this special deep dive. Today we're looking at what happens when the diagnostic X-ray of history comes back blurry. We're looking at a text that essentially broke the machine.
Yes.
The source material for our conversation today is a highly detailed academic essay by Daniel B. Wallace titled Mark 16.8 is the conclusion to the second gospel. And our mission today is to investigate the textual evidence, the historical anomalies, and the literary arguments surrounding where the Gospel of Mark actually ends. And, we want to discover what that means for how you, the listener, read the text.
To set the stage for you, we are looking at one of the most heavily debated questions in the entire field of New Testament scholarship. Wallace begins his essay by citing a joke from the comedian George Burns.
Oh, I love this one.
Yeah, Burns said the secret of a good sermon is to have a good beginning and a good ending, and the two should be as close together as possible.
That is fantastic. I think we have all sat through a few sermons where we wish the preacher had taken George Burns' advice.
Absolutely. But Wallace points out the historical irony here when it comes to the Gospel of Mark. Mark essentially created a brand new literary genre. Nobody had written a gospel before him.
Right.
And his work was so highly regarded that it was copied extensively by Matthew and Luke. Yet, despite being the pioneer of the genre, Mark's gospel was the least copied standalone book in early Christianity.
Wow.
And a massive reason for that neglect is that he left us with an ending that has puzzled, frustrated, and confused readers for 2 millennia.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get too far into the weeds of the textual evidence and the Greek manuscripts, we need to address something critical about our own perspective.
Good call.
As the hosts of Reformed Thinking, we both hold to Protestant Christian beliefs, specifically Reformed theology, and we adhere to the Westminster Confession. However, we want to be completely clear with you. Today, we are impartially reporting the contents of Wallace's essay.
Yes, we are.
We are not taking sides or endorsing the viewpoints of the text, especially in areas where Wallace critiques the Westminster Confession's view on textual preservation. We are simply conveying the ideas and the historical data as they're written in the original source material.
That is a crucial distinction to make up front because this topic touches on some highly sensitive theological nerves for many people. To frame the difference between how the gospel writers approach their conclusions, Wallace uses an analogy that is quite illuminating. He suggests that we can look at the authors through the lens of different preaching styles.
Yeah, I love this analogy because it makes the literary style so recognizable. Wallace says the Apostle John is like a Baptist preacher who finishes his sermon in chapter 20. He reaches a perfectly logical theological conclusion.
Spot on.
But then he just has to add an appendix. It's like the preacher deciding to sing one more chorus of Just As I Am before he can actually dismiss the congregation. He adds chapter 21 to tie up a few loose ends about Peter.
Yeah, he just can't let them go.
Right. But Mark, conversely, is like a Methodist preacher who cuts a sermonette incredibly short. He delivers these rapid-fire, high-stakes theological points, but then he just abruptly stops. He leaves his congregation sitting there in the pews with lingering questions rather than tying everything up in a neat, satisfying bow.
The contrast is striking when you lay them side by side. John finishes his gospel twice, while Mark leaves the reader completely hanging. And that leads us to a fundamental question. Why do modern scholars disagree so intensely on where Mark's gospel actually ends?
It's a great question.
You would think looking at the physical evidence would settle it. But the answer, according to Wallace, lies in the baggage of presuppositions. Scholars don't just look at raw data in a vacuum, they look through the lens of their prior academic commitments. They wear different sets of glasses that color how they view the X-ray.
Wallace breaks down 3 major presuppositions that dictate how a scholar reads the evidence. I want to walk through these because understanding the mechanism of how scholars think is just as critical as knowing what they think.
Absolutely.
First, there is source criticism. This involves theories about who copied whom. If a scholar adheres to something called the Griesbach hypothesis, which is the idea of Matthean priority, they will inevitably struggle to accept a short ending for Mark.
Let's break down how that mechanism works. Matthean priority argues that Matthew wrote his gospel first, making it the original blockbuster account of Jesus' life.
Right.
According to this theory, Luke wrote second, using Matthew, then Mark wrote third, essentially creating a condensed Reader's Digest version of Matthew and Luke.
Right, so put yourself in the shoes of a scholar holding that view, like the late William Farmer. If you believe Mark wrote last, and he is sitting there at his desk looking at the beautiful, detailed, triumphant resurrection appearances already written down in Matthew and Luke, why in the world would he cut them out?
It makes no sense.
0 sense. Why would he choose to end his summary by just saying, and the women ran away terrified and said nothing? It makes absolutely zero logical sense for a summarizer to delete the climax of the story. So if you hold to Matthean priority, you are predisposed to believe Mark must have written a longer ending and it simply got lost.
The second presupposition involves textual criticism itself. This is the science of analyzing the physical manuscript families. A scholar's prior adherence to a specific theory, like the independent text types theory championed by Harry Sturz, will dictate how they weigh the raw data.
Yeah, the families.
To understand this, you need to know that ancient manuscripts are generally grouped into families or text types based on their geographical origin and their shared copying quirks. You have the Alexandrian text type from Egypt, the Western text type from Rome and North Africa, and the Byzantine text type from the Greek-speaking East.
And the physical realities of those regions matter so much. The Alexandrian manuscripts come from the dry sands of Egypt, which naturally preserves papyrus. So those texts are incredibly old, very lean and stripped down. But the Byzantine texts come from places like Constantinople. It is humid there. Manuscripts rotted faster and had to be recopied constantly by professional scribes who often smoothed out rough grammar over the centuries.
Precisely. So if you follow Sturz's theory that all these text types originated entirely independently in the 2nd century and hold equal weight, you measure the variance very differently. You might look at a smoothed-out Byzantine manuscript from the 9th century and give it the exact same authority as a rugged Alexandrian papyrus from the 3rd century. Your theory dictates your diagnostic process.
Right. The glasses you wear change what you see.
The third presupposition Wallace highlights is bibliology and the doctrine of preservation. This is where theology intersects directly with the physical textual data. Scholars like John Bergen and Wilbur Pickering argued forcefully that God would simply not allow the ending of his inspired word to be physically lost to history.
That's a strong claim.
It is. Pickering once stated flatly that if God permitted the original ending of Mark to vanish, then we do not really possess an inspired text today. For them, divine preservation functions as a guarantee that the true text will always remain accessible, usually by virtue of being present in the vast majority of surviving manuscripts.
Okay, so how does Wallace address that?
Wallace counters this by looking at the specific theological frameworks. He claims the doctrine of preservation, particularly as it was formulated in the 1646 Westminster Confession, lacks a direct biblical base. He argues that it is neither wise nor safe for text critics to force physical, historical evidence to conform to theological doctrines not explicitly detailed in Scripture. This raises an important question. How often do our strongly held beliefs act as blinders, preventing us from objectively evaluating the historical evidence right in front of us?
That is a phenomenal question to ask yourself no matter what field you are in. And what makes Wallace's essay so compelling is that he doesn't just point the finger at other scholars. He shares a very personal, transparent story about his own academic blinders.
Yeah, his own journey, well, his own path, rather.
Right. For 17 years, Wallace held firmly to Sturz's textual views regarding independent text types, and he firmly believed in Matthean priority. He taught these specific theories to students at multiple academic institutions. He built his career on them.
Changing your mind after 17 years of public teaching is a massive undertaking.
It really is. It was only when he was forced to teach a doctoral seminar at Dallas Theological Seminary, quite literally because there was no one else available on the faculty to teach it, that his entire paradigm shifted.
Wow.
To prepare for this high-level seminar, he had to sit down and read over 10,000 pages of dense, text-critical material to get up to speed. During that intense, concentrated reading, his academic foundation just crumbled. He realized the Byzantine text family was not historically equal to the Alexandrian and Western texts. He shifted his entire methodology to something called reasoned eclecticism.
Which is essentially a technical term, meaning you stop blindly trusting one specific family of manuscripts, like a loyalty program, and you start judging every single textual variant on a case-by-case basis. You look at the date, the geographical spread, the scribal habits, and the internal grammar. You act like an impartial detective for every single word.
Spot on. He abandoned Matthean priority entirely. He realized that scholars must pursue objective truth rather than trying to protect their preferred presuppositions. Which brings up an analytical question for you. How often do we let a mechanical, checklist approach to data substitute for actual critical thinking?
Too often.
Wallace quotes the scholar Gunther Zonz in the essay, who noted that at every single stage of manuscript evaluation, the critic has to actually use their brains. If textual criticism didn't require a human being to think critically and weigh motives, you could just hand a slide rule or a calculator to anyone and leave it to them to settle the problems of the New Testament text.
Since presuppositions undeniably color how we interpret data, we need to strip those away and look at the raw, physical, external evidence itself. We will start with the dominant tradition in the manuscripts, which is the long ending. These are verses 9 through 20 of Mark chapter 16.
Now, if you just look at the raw numbers, the sheer volume of evidence for the long ending is massive. Over 95% of all surviving Greek manuscripts and ancient versions contain these 12 verses.
95%.
Yeah. It spans broad geographies representing Western, Caesarean, and Byzantine text types. It is also quoted by early church fathers. Irenaeus, writing in the late 2nd century, clearly quotes from verse 19, stating explicitly that it comes from the Gospel of Mark. So this isn't some fringe, isolated reading. It is the overwhelming numerical majority.
Right.
Which begs the question, wait, hold on. If 95% of the physical evidence points one way, how is this even a debate? In any other scientific or historical field, 95% is an absolute slam dunk. Why are we ignoring the vast majority of the evidence?
That is the most natural reaction to have when you hear that statistic. But in textual criticism, you do not count manuscripts, you weigh them.
Okay, unpack that.
Let me give you an analogy. Imagine a terrible traffic accident happens in an intersection. Two people are standing on the corner and see the whole thing clearly from start to finish. They give their eyewitness testimony.
Right.
Meanwhile, someone a block away hears the crash, runs over, and then goes to a crowded coffee shop and tells 100 people a slightly exaggerated version of what they think happened.
Oh, I see where this is going.
If a detective comes along, do they survey the 100 people in the coffee shop and declare their version the truth because they have a 95% majority? No. Those 100 people all trace back to one flawed source. The two actual eyewitnesses carry far more weight than the 100 people repeating a secondary story.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
The older, more direct lines of transmission matter more than the sheer number of later copies. But scholars who defend the long ending, like William Farmer, still have to explain why those early eyewitness manuscripts lack verses 9 through 20.
Yes, they do.
Farmer argued that Alexandrian scribes intentionally deleted those 12 verses, and he proposed two specific reasons for this massive amputation.
Right. First, Farmer claimed these early scribes were deeply bothered by a perceived timeline discrepancy regarding the resurrection. Mark 16.9 states that Jesus rose early on the first day of the week. Farmer thought ancient scribes saw this as conflicting with Matthew's timeline.
Okay.
Second, Farmer pointed to the seemingly embarrassing promises contained in verses 17 and 18. These are the verses where Jesus says believers will be able to handle snakes and drink deadly poison without being harmed. Farmer theorized that these verses were so practically problematic and embarrassing for early Christians that scribes decided the safest route was just to excise the entire 12-verse ending.
I have to push back on that using Wallace's arguments.
Yeah.
Because Farmer's theory completely falls apart when you actually look at the mechanics of the data.
Yeah.
First, regarding the timeline discrepancy, Matthew is the chronological outlier, not Mark. If you look at the Greek text, Mark 16.9 perfectly agrees with Luke 24.1 and John 20.1. All three of them clearly state the resurrection happened early on the first day of the week. Matthew is the only one who uses a very specific Greek phrasing that translates to late on the Sabbath or after the Sabbath.
Right.
So think about the logic here. If a scribe is sitting at a desk trying to fix a timeline discrepancy across the four Gospels, they would alter the one outlier, Matthew. They wouldn't look at Mark, who agrees with Luke and John, and decide to delete 12 entire verses just to fix a problem that Matthew created.
The logic just does not hold up to scribal habits. And the second part of Farmer's argument, that the early church was embarrassed by the snakes and poison, is also historically inaccurate.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The early church was absolutely not embarrassed by the snake and poison verses.
Yeah.
When you actually read the writings of the early church fathers, they loved those verses. Patristic writers quoted verses 15 through 20 far more frequently than they ever quoted verses 9 through 14.
That completely flips the script on Farmer's argument. If the scribes were truly embarrassed by the second half of the ending, you would expect them to keep the first half. They would keep the relatively tame, standard resurrection appearances in verses 9 through 14, and they would only hit delete on the snakes and poison.
Yeah, just trim the weird stuff.
But we have zero physical evidence of that ever happening in any manuscript. In fact, we see a steady stream of church fathers from the 2nd to the 5th century alluding to the snake and poison verses with absolute confidence, while nobody really mentions the first half of the passage until the 4th century.
If scribes were bothered by a small section, they would just cut those specific lines. Think about it like a modern typo. If you were reading the final chapter of a Harry Potter book and you spot a glaring typo on the last page, you might take a pen and correct that one word. You do not rip the last 30 pages out of the book and throw them in the fireplace.
That would be extreme.
Wallace uses a medical analogy here that is brilliant. When scribes find a small textual problem, they perform plastic surgery. They make a tiny, precise incision, alter a word or two, and stitch it back up seamlessly. They do not amputate the entire leg to cure a case of athlete's foot. Deleting 12 highly detailed verses of post-resurrection narrative just to get rid of a snake reference defies every known law of ancient scribal behavior.
Having systematically dismantled the theory that scribes deleted the ending out of embarrassment, we have to turn to the only logical alternative. Scribes added the long ending because they were immensely uncomfortable with the gospel concluding at verse 8. Let's break down the physical manuscripts that support the short ending.
Let's do it.
As we noted, there are not many of them numerically, but their historical pedigree is absolutely remarkable. The two heavyweights in this category are Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus.
Let's explain what those actually are, because they are marvels of ancient engineering. These are not little scraps of papyrus. These are massive 4th century Alexandrian codices. A codex is an ancient book with bound pages rather than a scroll.
Right, bound pages.
They were incredibly expensive to produce, requiring the skins of hundreds of animals to create the vellum pages. They are the oldest complete or nearly complete Greek Bibles in existence. They represent a very ancient, high-quality line of textual transmission dating all the way back to the early 2nd century. And in both of these massive premium codices, the Gospel of Mark ends precisely at verse 8 with the words, "For they were afraid." There is a hard stop.
Now, people who passionately defend the long ending love to point out a physical feature found specifically in Codex Vaticanus. Vaticanus is formatted with 3 neat columns of text per page. The Gospel of Mark ends near the bottom of the 2nd column on a page. And the scribe left the entire 3rd column completely blank before starting the Gospel of Luke on the very next page.
A blank column.
Yes, scholars like William Lane argue that this blank column is a smoking gun. They claim it proves the scribe knew about a longer ending, realized they did not have it in their immediate source text, and deliberately left a blank space so it could be filled in later.
It sounds like a highly compelling clue, like something out of an investigative thriller. But the theory evaporates when you actually look at the rest of Codex Vaticanus. The scribe leaving a blank space at the end of a book is not a singular, unique phenomenon isolated to the Gospel of Mark.
No, it's not.
Vaticanus has similar, and in some cases even larger, blank spaces after the books of Tobit to Esdras and Daniel. You cannot logically argue that the scribe was leaving space for missing text in all of those Old Testament instances. It was simply a formatting quirk. When they transitioned between certain major books or sections, they occasionally left a column blank.
Furthermore, modern researchers recently discovered an incredible detail about how the scribes of Vaticanus operated. They used a system of double dots in the margins, referred to by scholars as umlauts, to mark known textual variants.
Oh, wow.
If they were copying a text and knew that another manuscript had a different word or an extra sentence, they put an umlaut in the margin to signal to the reader, hey, there is a known discrepancy here. They used this marking system over 700 times in the New Testament alone. It was a highly organized system of quality control.
700 times.
Yet when you look at the margin next to Mark 16.8, there is absolutely no umlaut. The scribe gave zero indication whatsoever that they knew of any alternative ending.
The Greek manuscripts are just the beginning of the diagnostic process. The short ending is witnessed across incredibly diverse ancient translations. You have the Sinaitic Syriac version, which physically dates to the 4th century but represents a textual tradition from the late 2nd century.
Yes.
You have around 100 Armenian manuscripts that entirely lack the long ending, and we can trace that Armenian tradition back to a 5th century revision that was based on Greek texts brought all the way from Constantinople. You also have the 2 oldest Georgian manuscripts and a very early Sahidic Coptic manuscript from Egypt.
Notice the geographical spread of those witnesses. You have translations from Egypt to Syria, all the way up to the Caucasus Mountains. These are geographically isolated Christian communities, operating in different languages, all independently agreeing that the Gospel of Mark stops abruptly at verse 8.
We can also trace the patristic evidence, the writings of the early church leaders, which reveals a fascinating historical trajectory. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, highly prominent, widely read fathers like Clement of Alexandria and Origen are entirely silent on the long ending.
Complete silence.
They never quote it. They never allude to it. When we reach the 4th century, the great church historian Eusebius explicitly states that the accurate copies conclude the story of verse 8. He notes that this short ending is the case in nearly all the copies of Mark available to him.
Nearly all.
Then in the 5th century, Jerome echoes this exact sentiment, stating that almost all Greek codices are without the passage. Yet, despite knowing this, Jerome includes the long ending in his famous Latin Vulgate translation.
That is a critical juncture in the history of the text. Why would Jerome, who is arguably the greatest biblical scholar of his day, deliberately include 12 verses if he explicitly stated that the best, most accurate Greek copies lacked them?
To understand Jerome's motive, you have to understand the immense psychological pressure of his job. Jerome was a brilliant scholar, but he was dealing with a highly volatile, deeply emotional public. Around the year 400, a literal riot broke out in the city of Tripoli over Jerome's translation work.
A riot.
Yes. St. Augustine actually wrote to Jerome about this incident. The local bishop in Tripoli was reading from Jerome's new translation of the book of Jonah. In Jonah chapter 4, there is a plant that grows over Jonah to give him shade. The traditional older translation called it a gourd. Jerome, looking at the Hebrew, translated it as ivy.
Oh, no.
When the congregation heard the word ivy, they absolutely lost their minds. They started yelling. They accused the bishop of falsifying the scriptures. The Jewish authorities had to be called in to verify the translation. The bishop almost lost his entire congregation over a piece of Old Testament shrubbery.
It perfectly illustrates the visceral, protective attachment everyday people had to the text they were familiar with.
Spot on. So put yourself in Jerome's sandals. If people formed a violent mob over a botanical translation in Jonah, imagine the absolute chaos, the widespread rioting. If Jerome had published a new Latin Bible that completely deleted the resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ from the Gospel of Mark,
It would have been pandemonium.
he would have been branded a heretic immediately. He likely included the long ending in the Vulgate simply to keep the peace and ensure his translation was actually adopted by the churches. But the historical trajectory continues. By the time you get to Victor of Antioch in the 5th or 6th century, Victor notes that very many copies end at verse 8, but very many also end at verse 20. He eventually declares the longer copies are more accurate. You can clearly see the long ending steadily moving from a minority status in the early centuries to a majority status as time progresses.
What's fascinating here is how the motive for that gradual addition is so blatantly obvious when you look at the literary structure of the gospel itself. Look at the narrative Mark has constructed. Jesus explicitly predicts his death and resurrection 3 separate times in Mark 8.31, 9.31, and 10.34.
Right.
He repeatedly tells the disciples in no uncertain terms that he will be killed by the religious leaders and will rise after 3 days. If the gospel ends at 16.8, the women flee the empty tomb in absolute terror. They say nothing to anyone. And these 3 massive foundational prophecies, these 3 massive prophecies remain totally unfulfilled within the actual narrative framework of the book.
The theological terror of a failed prophecy would be unbearable for a copyist. Ancient scribes simply could not tolerate reading a gospel that lacked a definitive, on-the-page resurrection appearance. The internal psychological pressure to resolve that narrative tension, to fulfill Jesus' prophecies, and to provide closure for the reader was overwhelming.
To prove that scribes were actively, consciously trying to fix what they perceive as an abrupt, broken ending, we just have to look at the sheer variety of alternative endings that popped up in the manuscript record. It is not just a binary choice between the short ending at verse 8 and the long ending at verse 20. There is a third distinct option that surfaced: the intermediate ending.
Yes, the intermediate ending. It is found in Codex Babiensis, which is an old Latin manuscript that traces its lineage back to a 2nd century papyrus, as well as a few other witnesses. When you read the intermediate ending, it is highly condensed. It is a colorless, almost bureaucratic summary.
Very dry.
It essentially says that the women briefly reported to Peter and his companions, and then Jesus himself sent the disciples out from east to west with the sacred, imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. It lacks all the vivid storytelling of Mark. It sounds like a theological mission statement rather than a narrative.
The intermediate ending provides the ultimate smoking gun for textual critics. In several manuscripts, including 4 Greek uncials dating from the 7th to the 9th centuries, plus several Sahidic and Ethiopic manuscripts, the scribes did something entirely illogical. They copied the brief intermediate ending, and then they immediately copied the 12-verse long ending right after it.
They just jammed them together.
Yes, and doing so creates a jarring, unavoidable, logical contradiction right there on the parchment. Think about it. In the intermediate ending, the women go and tell Peter the news, and Jesus commissions the disciples to go from east to west. Then the very next verse, the start of the long ending, says Jesus appeared first to Mary Magdalene, and when she went and told the disciples, they were mourning and weeping and did not believe her.
It is like watching a movie where the studio releases a director's cut, and they stick 2 completely different contradictory post-credit scenes back to back.
Yeah.
In the first scene, the hero tells the team the villain is dead, and they celebrate. In the next scene, the hero discovers the villain for the first time, and nobody believes him. It proves the film editor just spliced 2 different reels together out of fear of leaving something out. Why would an ancient scribe put 2 contradictory endings back to back on expensive vellum? It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the ancestors of those specific manuscripts only possessed the brief, colorless intermediate ending.
That is the logical deduction. No scribe who already possessed the rich, detailed 12 verses of the long ending would ever wake up one day and decide to wedge a redundant, contradictory 2-sentence summary in front of it. It only works the other way around. They had the intermediate ending in their master copy, and later they found the long ending in a different manuscript. Faced with a choice, they decided to combine them.
Because they were terrified of getting it wrong.
100%. This highlights the golden rule of ancient copyists. If in doubt, don't throw it out. Scribes viewed these texts as divinely inspired. The absolute worst sin a scribe could commit was omitting a word of God. So they practiced a policy of accumulation. If they saw 2 variations, they often just included both to be safe. We also see this deep hesitation in the marginal notes of the manuscripts themselves.
Right.
About a dozen manuscripts include explicit textual notes from the scribes stating that the gospel ends at verse 8 in some copies but continues in others. 5 manuscripts actually place asterisks or obelisks, which are ancient proofreading marks used by scholars in Alexandria to flag doubtful lines in Homer's epics, right next to the long ending to indicate explicit historical doubt about its authenticity.
I want you to step back and consider the sheer instability of this text. If the long ending was originally penned by Mark in the 1st century, why does the Gospel of Mark have at least 5 distinct ending variations scattered throughout the manuscript tradition?
It's wild.
We have the short ending in verse 8. We have the long ending up to verse 20. We have the intermediate ending. We have the intermediate combined with the long. And we even have a bizarre variation called the Freerlogian, which is a massive extra paragraph inserted right into the middle of the long ending in a manuscript known as Codex W, where Jesus and the disciples have a long theological conversation about the age of Satan.
It's just a mess.
No other book in the entire New Testament suffers from this level of concluding chaos. The end of Romans is a little messy, but nothing like this. It points heavily to early scribes scrambling for centuries to fix a text they genuinely felt was broken.
Having thoroughly examined the external manuscripts and the historical circumstances, the conversation naturally requires us to shift to the internal evidence. This involves putting down the physical parchment and analyzing the actual words on the page. We have to look at the vocabulary, the syntax, and the literary style of the passage. The primary question is, does the long ending actually sound like the author who wrote the first 16 chapters of the Gospel of Mark?
When you look at the Greek, the linguistic anomalies are striking. It is not just that verses 9 through 20 contain over a dozen words found nowhere else in Mark. You cannot just look at one rare word and cry foul. Every author uses unique words occasionally based on the subject matter.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The issue is not the presence of rare words. It is the cumulative density of those anomalies. There is not a single passage in the entirety of Mark 1.1 through 16.8 that is comparable to the dense cluster of stylistic, grammatical, and lexical anomalies found in those final 12 verses.
Yeah.
The transition between verse 8 and verse 9 is incredibly disjointed. In verse 8, the grammatical subject of the sentence is the women at the tomb. In verse 9, the subject suddenly shifts to Jesus, but without explicitly naming him in a way that smoothly connects to the previous sentence in Greek. It reads like the beginning of an entirely different document that was glued on to the end.
Furthermore, there is a major source critical clue hiding in plain sight. We mentioned earlier that Matthew and Luke clearly use Mark as a primary source document for their own Gospels. When you read them side by side, Matthew and Luke follow Mark's narrative template incredibly closely. They use his sequence of events.
Right.
But when you get to the post-resurrection accounts, Matthew and Luke suddenly look drastically different from each other. They diverge completely. Matthew has Jesus appearing on a mountain in Galilee. Luke has Jesus appearing on the road to Emmaus and in Jerusalem. The absolute best explanation for this sudden radical divergence is that they lost their shared literary map. Their copies of Mark ended at 16.8, so they had to rely on their own independent sources to finish the story.
Now, some defenders of the long ending argue that verses 9 through 20 do contain some recognizable Markinism-specific phrases or vocabulary words that Mark favors throughout his gospel. They argue this proves Mark wrote it. But Wallace addresses this counter-argument with a brilliant historical parallel involving a modern scholar named Morton Smith.
This is one of the wildest stories in biblical scholarship. Decades ago, Morton Smith claimed to have discovered a lost manuscript in a monastery, which he called the Secret Gospel of Mark. He produced photographs of a text that he argued was a longer, alternative version of the Gospel.
Right.
Several top-tier linguistic scholars analyzed the Greek text Smith provided and concluded that its internal style was overwhelmingly Markan. It had all the right vocabulary. It sounded a lot like Mark. But it turned out Smith executed an elaborate hoax. He forged the document himself. He literally sat down and reverse-engineered Mark's writing style to trick the academic community.
The implication for Mark 16 is undeniable. If a modern scholar, whose native tongue is English, not Greek, can forge a document that mimics Mark's style far better than the long ending does, then an ancient scribe, a native speaker of Koine Greek living in the 2nd century, who intentionally set out to write a satisfying ending for the gospel, could certainly sprinkle in a few recognizable Markan phrases. In fact, even the intermediate ending and the Friarlogian, which absolutely everyone agrees are later fabrications, contain Markan linguistic features. A forger naturally tries to sound like the original author. Identifying a few familiar words does not prove authenticity when the broader stylistic fingerprint is a total mismatch.
So we arrive at the million-dollar problem. If the physical manuscripts, the historical timeline, and the internal grammar all point to Mark 16.8 being the true ending, why would an author finish a book so abruptly? Why end with the women fleeing in fear and saying nothing to anyone? We have to tackle the final literary arguments.
We do.
Scholars who reject the idea of an intentional short ending usually raise three main objections. First, they argue that open-ended books are a modern, Kafkaesque literary convention that ancient readers would simply not understand. Second, they propose the mechanical lost leaf theory, suggesting the final page of the original document simply tore off and blew away before it could be copied. Third, they point out a grammatical issue. Mark 16.8 ends with the Greek conjunction gar, which translates to for. They argue a book written in Greek simply cannot end with the word for.
Let us systematically dismantle these objections, starting with the mechanical ones. The lost leaf theory sounds plausible until you look at the physical realities of ancient bookmaking. The theory assumes Mark was written in a codex, with bound pages that could easily detach. But we know that late 1st century texts were almost exclusively written on scrolls.
And the mechanics of a scroll destroy the lost leaf theory. When you make a scroll, you glue sheets of papyrus together. The outer edge, the beginning of the text, takes all the beating from the elements and the constant handling. But when you are finished reading, the end of the document is rolled securely on the inside of the cylinder, wrapped tightly against the wooden dowel.
It's totally safe.
Yeah, the ending is actually the most heavily protected part of the entire physical text. For the ending to be physically lost before any copies were ever made, someone would have to leave the scroll completely unrolled upside down and exposed to the elements for an extended period, which was highly irregular and irresponsible. If a scroll gets damaged, you lose chapter 1, not chapter 16.
That leaves the grammatical objection, ending a book with the word gar, or for. For decades, scholars said this was grammatically impossible. But the scholar P.W. Vanderhorst laid that objection to rest by searching through ancient literature. He found a treatise by the ancient philosopher Plotinus that ends that way. Furthermore, Kelly Iverson researched ancient narrative literature and found numerous sentences ending in gar.
One striking example is Genesis 18.15 in the Greek Septuagint translation of the Old Testament. When Sarah is confronted by God about laughing at the prophecy of having a child in her old age, she denies it. The narrator concludes the thought by stating, "For she was afraid." It ends with the exact same Greek construction as Mark 16.8. So grammatically, it is entirely possible to end a sentence and even a narrative scene with that word.
That leaves only the literary objection. Is an unresolved cliffhanger just a modern existential trick? J. Lee Magnus demonstrated in his research that suspended endings absolutely existed in antiquity. It was a known, albeit rare, literary device. In fact, the author Luke likely utilized this exact technique at the end of the book of Acts. He leaves the Apostle Paul under house arrest in Rome, his legal fate completely unresolved for 2 whole years.
Right.
The reader reaches the end of the scroll crying out, what happened next? Did he stand before Caesar? Was he executed? The author deliberately refuses to satisfy that curiosity.
That literary brilliance is the key to understanding Mark's design. A suspended ending forces the reader to become an active participant in the story. The literature expresses more than it says, demanding that the reader supply the resolution. When the author suspends the narration of a heavily foreshadowed event, like the resurrection appearances of Jesus, it makes the impact of that event even greater in the expectant mind of the reader. So what does this all mean? We've looked at the manuscripts, the grammar, and the history. This brings us to the theological payoff of Wallace's entire argument. There is a stunning literary parallel between Mark chapter 9 and Mark chapter 16. In chapter 9, verse 32, right after Jesus predicts his death and resurrection, Mark tells us the disciples did not understand the statement and were afraid to ask him about it. Mark uses a specific Greek verb tense here, an imperfect tense verb, which conveys continuous ongoing action in the past. They were continually afraid. Then when we finally get to the empty tomb in Mark 16.8, Mark uses that exact same imperfect verb. The women fled, and they were continually afraid.
The thematic resonance between those 2 chapters is unmistakable. Throughout the entire gospel, Peter and the disciples are depicted as half-blind. They never quite grasp what Jesus is doing. When Peter confesses Jesus as the Messiah in chapter 8, he envisions a conquering, militant, political king who will overthrow Rome. He actually rebukes Jesus for even suggesting that the Messiah must suffer and die. The disciples were consistently slow to get the message. They wanted the glory without the cross. Mark uses the fear in chapter 9 and the lingering fear in chapter 16 to frame their consistent lack of comprehension.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Mark intentionally drops a narrative template to corner the reader. He refuses to neatly tie a bow on the story because he wants to confront you, the reader, with a choice. He's essentially saying, look, the disciples ran away in fear because they could not handle the reality of a suffering Messiah. What are you going to do? He demands that you answer the question for yourself. Will you embrace Jesus in his suffering so that you can see him in his glory, or will you run away in fear when the path requires carrying a cross?
By consciously withholding the comfort of a neatly resolved resurrection appearance, Mark forces the reader to rely on faith rather than sight. He heightens the presence of the resurrected Christ by making his physical absence in the narrative so conspicuous. You have to read the abrupt ending not as a failure of historical transmission, but as an absolute masterclass in theological storytelling. The abruptness is not a mistake. It is the entire point of the book.
We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into textual criticism, manuscript history, and literary analysis. It is a highly technical topic, but looking into the mechanics of how we got our text completely alters how you experience reading it.
We want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own as you go about your week. If the earliest written gospel deliberately withheld the comfort of a neatly resolved ending specifically to challenge its readers and demand faith, how might that alter the way we consume modern media and literature? Are we too conditioned by our culture to expect satisfying, neatly packaged conclusions in 30 minutes? And in demanding that immediate satisfaction, do we miss the incredible impact of unresolved tension in our own intellectual and spiritual lives?
That is a question worth wrestling with. Keep questioning your presuppositions, keep examining the text with a critical eye, and be sure to tune in next time for another deep dive.